Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Mark Langevin and Global Trade Relations. I hope all you guys are doing well, remembering your faces and your names, and really interested in the discussion posts that you guys are now putting up. And I'm trying to respond to most of them, especially those that require some correction or analysis or even comments or questions. That's a vote of confidence for you guys when I actually comment on your posts. Also thinking about you guys staying safe, teleworking or working, trying to stay safe. I just got a few masks from a Brazilian producer in Connecticut. My wife arranged to send to us, so I'm now wearing a mask when I go out, which is rare, just like everybody else. I'm on my balcony a lot, working and so forth. And yeah, I started watching The Wire. It's an older program, but based out of Baltimore, and everyone recommends it, so I'm doing that and enjoying it. Last, I just want to talk a little bit about COVID-19. You know, all of us are keeping up, and so I was doing a little bit of research on the Brazilian side, in particular, the difficulty that Brazilians are now reporting in getting their contracts fulfilled overseas for personal protective equipment and ventilators and so forth. A lot of Chinese suppliers who they had contracted with have communicated to them that they no longer can supply the products. The state of Maranhão recently acknowledged that they're no longer even going to contract overseas for this types of equipment because all their contracts have been torn up, basically. And then we have some reports that the United States government has been intervening to, let's say, redirect these shipments away from other countries like Brazil and towards the United States. So what do we see? We see very, high levels of scarcity of these products, protective products, ventilators, and some of the chemicals and biological agents for some of these treatments and tests and so forth. Um, and a rush to try to have manufacturers that don't normally make these products begin to make them. So in Brazil, the automobile industry, similar to the United States, has started to get involved. Mercedes-Benz is working with a technical institute in Brazil to manufacture ventilators, while some of the federal universities are focusing on new designs for ventilators that would be much cheaper to produce. And I think that will be really important moving forward in some of the developing worlds that um, become infected and have high transmission rates and so forth, which we're still bracing for, right? Um, Something akin to Ecuador, which has really suffered through this outbreak, almost to the extent of the state of New York. But also Ford and Scania, which is Volvo and now owned by Ford, will be making personal protective equipment, similar to some of the things that are happening here in the United States. And it's because Brazil has a manufacturing base. Both the Minister of Health and a former presidential candidate have also complained that in the past decade, Brazil's medical equipment manufacturers have not been producing as much because of these cheap imports coming from China and some of the other overseas um, producers, suppliers, and so forth. So that's where we're kind of left with right now. But anyway, I've posted on LinkedIn a little note about that. Just want to make people aware that are interested in 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 Brazil and manufacturing and the COVID-19 outbreak. Um, Also, yeah, I'm looking at my other computer here. This is not a TV studio, so I don't have a producer, someone to tell me what to do. Which, when I do make some appearances, mostly on Al Jazeera and and CGTN, people are telling me what to do, and I have to do it all myself here. So, I'm a little bit shy of the camera, my own camera. Um, but anyway, getting back to the class, I think things are moving forward smoothly. Most of you are posting to the discussions. If you haven't already, you need to jump in there. That's your participation. It's also a way of working with the readings and interacting with your colleagues and myself to really move these discussions further. And each week there's a little bit different topic and so forth. This week we're dealing with the cotton dispute, which was a kind of emblematic or very high profile trade dispute between the United States and Brazil. And of course, you've read Guan and my own article on it. Maybe you've also seen a few other articles in the past. I mean, it has been off and on, kind of the second page of the newspaper for more than a decade and a half, maybe coming on 2 decades now. Anyway, my own experience, I've posted a few thoughts today for all of you to take a look at if you're interested. It's obviously not mandatory, but it might help fill in blanks with the scholarly literature and so forth. I did want to mention that, similar to a lot of you guys, I'm interested in both the scholarly and the applied side of trade politics and trade policy. And that's how I got involved in the cotton dispute. I'd really been writing a lot on commercial relations between Brazil and the United States, published an academic paper in a very prestigious journal in Brazil about orange juice and sugar policy here in the United States and its relationship to the Electoral College in Florida, really a Putman-esque type analysis, in fact, giving him all the credit for the framework and taking an element of that framework, the political institution side, and taking it for a spin on this particular case to try to illustrate, not to prove or anything, but just illustrate Putman's propositions on how political institutions interact with factional interests to create trade policy and the potential for ratifying any kind of trade agreement and so forth. So I just focused on orange juice and sugar, and that allowed me to take a look at the cotton case more from a distance, but obviously a comparable case as well. I didn't choose to do the cotton case because people weren't taking a look at sugar and orange juice, but as it through serendipity and my own experiences working in Brazil, eventually came into contact with the Cotton Producer Association in Mato Grosso, which is the state in the central west of Brazil that produces most of the cotton, 50 to 60% of it. The political leaders of cotton production in Brazil kind of come from that state typically. And I spent some time out there, befriended people. I was helping a firm test some products, and we decided we wanted to test on cotton. So I met the cotton guys and explained to them how U.S. trade policy works with respect to agriculture. And of course, they were very enthused with the cotton case because it had gone kind of farther than they had expected, but there still weren't any tangible results to it when I met up with these people in 2008, 2009, and then started in the second half of 2009 when the cotton case was definitely towards the last lap in the arbitration stage in the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement body. Then we began to have discussions, and they began to actually pay me for analysis work and to come to Mato Grosso and explain to the board of directors and major cotton growers exactly how things work, because the Brazilian government had kind of left them in a difficult position. The Brazilian government, all their work, all their legal work with regard to the cotton case at the WTO, the econometrics, hiring Sidley Austin, a famous trade law firm, all that money was paid by the cotton growers themselves, but they weren't really getting the full report from the Brazilian government about what was happening. So as things wound down, they asked the question, okay, so we won the case, but what did we win? Did we, is the U.S. going to stop suppressing world prices? Or are they going to pay us out in some sort of way? So this came to a head, and I just began to, kind of inform them what was happening in Washington and so forth. And then April 2010, the United States government agreed that they couldn't comply with the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures of the WTO discipline, but they're going to try in the next farm bill, and then make a payment of $147.3 million to the Brazilian cotton producers, staggered in monthly payments beginning, I believe it was May 2010 that those began. And so then I began really working pretty hard with the cotton growers on a weekly basis, traveling a lot to Mato Grosso and Brasilia. And then in 2011, the National Producer Association, ABRAPA, hired me as a special international advisor to kind of carry the way forward because the WTO process had been concluded, but there was nothing to show for it. And that shows kind of the weakness of the process itself. And that's why I disagree with Guan in terms of, well, the process was necessary but insufficient, whereas most of the scholars of the DSB, like Guan, tend to overemphasize what it can really do. And it has been very successful in shaping and framing negotiations that led to mutual solutions on a number of cases. In the cotton case, this was not the case. And maybe it wasn't the case because agricultural subsidies amongst developed world countries like the United States, European Union, are so important to politics, potentially social stability, although I doubt that. But anyway, it continued on, and that's where I came in, kind of center stage, because I had been advocating in Mato Grosso that Brazilian cotton producers should engage U.S. cotton producers, probe them, find out what their, in a sense, priority schedule for their own preferences were, and then we could determine how we could maximize compliance, even though it would be partial, and potentially go for something bigger and better. So in late 2011, I began to engage the National Cotton Council on behalf of ABRAPA, in particular, president of ABRAPA at that time, Sergio Gimarco, who I didn't know but met, and we worked really well together. I really loved that guy. And he was courageous enough to say, "Hey, Mark, let's meet with the U.S. cotton growers, like you say, and let's do it." So we had a number of discrete meetings with the full leadership body of these two organizations in the midst of this case. The U.S. cotton growers hated the Brazilians for bringing this case to the WTO, but we met in places like Orlando, Atlanta, Memphis, where the kind of epicenter of cotton politics starts, because the National Cotton Council is headquartered there. We met in Brasilia, and we met in Miami. So we were meeting all the time. I was organizing the meetings. In the first part of the meetings, the U.S. cotton growers loved me because they thought I was the solution to their problem. And of course, I led them on a bit that, in fact, I might be a solution. At the same time, I also reminded them that I offered them a credible threat to take away their subsidies. So in that lurch, I became a more important person, and that's just the politics of being a professional negotiator. You want to kind of get in the thick of things and have people think of you as their worst nightmare or a potential solution to the problem, all at the same time. And the Brazilians, the cotton growers, treated me just like a colleague all the time. We were buddies, and let me go at this, banging away all the time. In fact, they rather be nice to the U.S. cotton growers and let me, kind of be mean and nasty. And that's what I did. At the same time, I said, look, I can help you guys achieve a solution that meets the terms of everybody. So that's what we did. There was a change of president in 2013. Prior to that, in July of 2012, we met in Brasilia at the behest of the Brazilian WTO ambassador, Azevedo, who's now the Director General of the WTO. He asked me to put together this meeting, and I said, do we think we can get to a mutual solution? Because I don't want to bring the gringos to Brasilia unless we think we can. And he assured both myself and the president of the NCC that in fact could happen. So we organized a really big meeting at the foreign ministry in Brasilia. And to all of our surprise, Azevedo introduced himself and then within minutes politely excused himself and left for his lieutenant to work out the details. And that was something that pissed off the United States government, the U.S. cotton producers, and my bosses at ABRAPA, the Brazilian Producers Association. They were very pissed off, and I was sitting next to the president. I was actually sitting between Azevedo and the president, and they just looked at me like, what the heck? is going on. They were very disappointed in their government at the time. And it looked like Brazil would have to move forward with trade retaliation to trigger a deeper compliance by the United States. Um, anyway, the new president would be coming on board in January 2013, Gilson Pinesso. I did not know Gilson very well. I'd met him on a few occasions, chatted. But he's one of the biggest cotton growers in the world, uh, both in Brazil and uh, about a decade ago, the Sudanese government asked him to teach the Sudanese how to grow cotton, and uh, he took on that as well. So a lot of different things going on there. But anyway, I met with Gilson at his offices in Campo Grande, Mato Grosso do Sul, which is a state next to Mato Grosso, also a big cotton production state. And he said, I told him, I said, Gilson, we can't do anything unless we pose a credible threat of retaliations. We need to work on the Brazilian government to begin to apply these retaliations in a strategic way. And he said, Mark, you know what? I don't know if we can trust the Brazilian government, but we can trust ourselves. I want you to go to Memphis and begin to hammer out an agreement with the U.S. cotton producers, and let's get the best deal that we possibly can get, and then we'll tell the governments to simply ratify it. And so that was our strategy beginning of 2013. I traveled to Memphis periodically um, and came to an agreement with the leadership of the National Cotton Council. We later had meetings, drafting meetings, where we decided we would draft a joint letter of recommendation. Um, and I did most of the negotiations on that. And then we met as two organizations in Miami and hammered out the last details of this joint letter of recommendation. And it was funny because while we brought the case to the WTO, the Brazilian side, we knew what we wanted, and so we put it on the table. And it took the National Cotton Council about 2 hours of a closed meeting in Miami after we'd basically finalized the letter for themselves to figure out like what had just happened. That the factional interests that they were most opposed to in Brazil had come to them and said, you know what, let's work this out. And that's exactly what we did. And they were all in a state of shock, to be quite honest, because they were basically vested with this interest in hating Brazil and Brazilians. And yet they were going to, in a sense, sign not a binding contract, but a joint letter to tell the two governments how to resolve the case. They did do that. They had very big opposition within their organization by the Texas cohort. Texas is the leading producer state of cotton in the United States. Most of the Texas producers wouldn't produce cotton if they didn't receive subsidies. They're very inefficient cotton growers. They don't exist in a free market. And so they really depended on these subsidies, but they had to reconcile themselves too. They were on the losing end of the WTO case, and now we were putting pressure on them to come and meet us in a compromise kind of negotiated settlement. So we did get that, and then I began to work with the Brazilian Foreign Ministry to help them deliver it up to the United States government. I remember I was in a meeting at the Foreign Ministry thereafter, and um, the diplomat in charge of the case said, "Mark, I can't put this on the table until the U.S. puts it on the table. Can you help the U.S. put it on the table?" So then I started working with the U.S. government. That didn't go very far, but eventually we got both governments to concede that a joint letter of recommendation by the two principal parties of the cotton dispute existed and was ready to be used by the governments to achieve a settlement. And we did. It was officially announced in October of 2014. It included a one-time $300 million payment to the Brazilian Cotton Institute. And we tracked that. That payment was made days after the agreement in October of 2014. In total, the financial package from 2010 to 2014 was over $650 million that went to the Brazilian producers. They were quite happy with that and are still very, very happy with that. We also made some improvements on compliance. We worked with Congress. I spent a lot of time with the agricultural committees in the Senate and the House to help them figure out how they could modify the legislation to decrease the price suppression effects on the world cotton market and satisfy the U.S. growers. So once we came to a decision, I then began to work with the National Cotton Council to try to get this thing through, and that was an odd experience too. Um, but it was kind of a historic case. I've written some on it. I'll probably write a little bit more. Um, I think most of the literature, as I mentioned in my little post today, analyzes the dispute settlement process, which I find not the most interesting because the real case was resolved through negotiations that involved both governments and factional interests. And so that's where things really get solved, and the DSB, in a sense, kind of codifies that in most cases, or creates a framework to assess the damages so that the governments can figure out what might be fair in the short term and how could we resolve it in the long term. I think the problem is, and this is something that we've discussed in the discussion post, is that it doesn't make any sense to do these kinds of financial settlements and mutual solutions unless we're going for bigger and bigger increments of global trade liberalization. And that's where we've stopped, right? Some of you have bought my argument, some haven't, but 2008, regardless, was a critical year that demonstrated that the United States didn't have the burn anymore or the fire to drive global trade liberalization. And that's been a problem, I think, for the world. It's not just the Great Recession that we're recovering from, and now COVID-19, but it's the slowdown in increases in international trade. And when I look at that, I'm not saying that international trade is, the solution to everybody's problems, but when international trade is growing, it allows for more and more people to participate in the global economy. And with each new person participating in these global assembling lines, whether they're agriculture or other extractive minerals, manufacturing or services, the size of the market is so much bigger that the return on investment and labor, that is to say, if you're working in these global assembling lines, is so much bigger. Now, it's more precarious, but people are making bigger returns. So if we're worried about family farmers in Africa, allowing them to grow commodity products that can, get a good price in the global marketplace, this is huge for poverty reduction and the kind of wealth accumulation that families need so that they can send their sons and daughters to college later on and so forth. And I've seen this repeated throughout Latin America and know a lot of my African colleagues who have gone through the same process themselves and so forth. So my own involvement was really based on the principle that, farmers and workers and investors should get a fair deal. And when governments subsidize non-strategic products and services only because of the politics and political influence of the beneficiaries, that hurts most of us most of the time. And so we've got to do something about that. But anyway, that's my few words, and hope to talk to you soon. Next week we'll be doing a lot of telephone calling about your research papers and so forth. I really look forward to that. I love working with students, and hey, we might end up actually publishing something together. Take care and be safe.